They laughed when he walked in, full suit, calm stride, documents in hand, and still they pointed, smirked, and asked whose assistant he was. One executive waved him toward the corner like he was lost. Another joked about whether janitorial staff now wore tailored blazers. He was the only black man in the room, and that was all they saw. Not the way he moved, not the confidence in his eyes, not the silence that said he had done this 100 times before. They assumed, mocked, and cut him off before he ever reached the table. No nameplate, no introduction, no question. Just a room full of people too certain of their own place to realize who they were pushing out. What happened next? They tried to erase the wrong man, and by the time they figured it out, it was already too late. If you want more stories where justice turns quietly but hits hard, hit subscribe. Let us know in the comments, what part grabbed you first? And where are you watching from? We're listening. The glass walls of the Ashcroft Global Conference Room reflected the harsh white light of a late-morning Manhattan sun. Everything about the space screamed money, from the pristine marble floors to the carbon fiber table surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. Dion Voss entered the room with a deliberate step, his charcoal gray suit pressed sharp, a slim case in hand, and a subtle confidence that did not announce itself but could not be missed. He scanned the room, mentally checking names and faces, identifying seating positions and patterns of power. He had done this countless times. And yet, as his foot crossed the threshold, the mood in the room shifted, just slightly. Two men near the window paused their conversation and glanced at him, then at each other. A woman near the corner lowered her tablet slowly, her eyes lingering on Dion's face with cool detachment. Another man, closest to the projector, didn't even look up. He simply smirked and kept typing. Dion gave a brief nod toward the table and moved toward the AV panel at the front. No one responded. They didn't have to. He had been in this exact silence before. He began setting up, connecting his laptop to the projector with practiced ease, calibrating the screen without asking for assistance. As the title slide integration forecast, Tier 1 consolidation strategy, flickered onto the screen, a voice behind him piped up with a chuckle. That's good. Tech's here. Hope this time we don't lose audio halfway through. The joke was followed by a scattered burst of laughter, mostly from the table's far end. Dion didn't look back. He heard it clearly enough. Another voice added, maybe grab him a badge. Building access for contractors ends at noon. This time the laughter was louder. As he clicked through the preview slides to double-check formatting, someone walked up beside him, a junior assistant with a tablet in one hand and uncertainty in his eyes. Excuse me, sir, we're going to need the projector for the pre-pitch dry run. We were told Darrow Vale's primary team would handle presentation duties today. His tone was courteous, but the underlying assumption was plain. Dion glanced down at the badge clipped to his suit, clearly marked with the Ashcroft transaction seal. He turned slightly toward the assistant, but before he could speak, another man at the table called out, "Let the guy finish setting it up. Then we'll take it from there. He's probably just testing signal strength." No one asked, no one confirmed. The room simply moved forward, confident in its own version of what was happening. Dion stepped aside momentarily, and as he reached down to grab the clicker, the assistant stepped in front of him and switched the HDMI input back to another laptop, one clearly marked with a sticker that read Kyle B. A new slide appeared on the screen. Client welcome brief presented by Kyle Beckman and team. Laughter continued as if on cue. Dion's name was nowhere on the slide. He stood still, saying nothing, observing, processing. Kyle, seated with one leg crossed over the other and coffee in hand, turned slightly and gestured toward the screen. "Can someone dim the lights? We're about to give the real pitch." That last part landed like a stone. A few people chuckled again, this time lower, tighter. Dion didn't flinch. He returned to his laptop, closed it slowly, and walked to a seat at the far end of the room without a word. Matthew Crane, the account analyst who had coordinated the room schedule, looked up from his phone, saw the exchange, and shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly aware something was off, but unwilling to correct it in front of the group. Dion's name wasn't mentioned again. The pitch began. Kyle's delivery was decent. Not exceptional, not seamless. He stumbled over 2 acronyms, mismatched a financial figure, and skipped a slide. But the room nodded along anyway. Polite interest masked a deeper complacency. For them, the performance was less about clarity and more about continuity. The moment seemed unassuming until Jeremy Stratton, the managing director with an affinity for asserting dominance through backhanded familiarity, strolled past Dion and paused just enough to draw attention. With a smile that stretched thin and cold across his face, he held out his empty espresso cup and, without meeting Dion's eyes, said in a tone dipped in performance, "Mind grabbing me another round? 2 sugars, no cream. Builds character." Around them, laughter erupted again, this time louder and more relaxed, as if the group had found its footing in the unwritten script of exclusion. One of the directors added cheerfully that everyone starts somewhere, and even he had fetched coffee during his early days, before nudging another colleague and whispering something about dues and roles that didn't quite land as a joke. Dion stood not because he felt compelled, but because the optics of resistance would play into a different stereotype, the defiant one, the troublemaker. He took the cup without a word, walked to the lounge, and filled it precisely, the way Jeremy had requested, then returned and placed it gently on the table without breaking stride. There was a smattering of mock gratitude and a sarcastic salute from Kyle Beckman, who clinked his own coffee cup as if to toast Dion's return to the fold. Nothing about the exchange was overtly hostile. That was the point. It was soft degradation, engineered to appear innocuous, while reinforcing a message that Dion already knew too well. Belonging was conditional, recognition negotiable, and respect withheld until proved multiple times over. He resumed his place at the table, jaw tight, breathing steady, mind still calculating. These games were nothing new. They happened in airports, in boardrooms, on stage panels where credentials were questioned only after he spoke. But this was not just about him anymore. He was the architect of the deal on the table, the one they couldn't afford to botch. And yet they treated him as a disposable extra in a scene already blocked out in their heads. The remainder of the break was filled with shallow chatter, but Dion's attention shifted subtly. Something didn't feel right. A tension beneath the surface, like a system being overwritten without warning. When the team reconvened, the energy in the room had shifted. The projector now displayed a modified version of the deck he had prepared, a slide layout that looked familiar, but stripped of signature elements he had carefully embedded to signal ownership and precision. The title had changed. His name was gone. In its place stood a new title slide, Integration Architecture Overview, presented by Trent Collier. Trent, a mid-level strategist who had only joined the acquisition team 2 days prior, was standing awkwardly by the screen, adjusting his cuffs like a man stepping into someone else's shoes and trying to convince himself they fit. He looked nervous but determined, his eyes darting toward Dion once, then quickly away. Dion felt a click before he heard it. Jeremy, standing near the light control panel, dimmed the room and gestured toward the screen. "All right, Trent, let's walk through this." Dion didn't move, didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He simply studied the screen, analyzing each transition, noticing how key framing was watered down, how timelines were flattened, and how forecasts had been clipped short. It was his work, but diluted, rushed, altered without credit or consultation. Pamela Yates, who had earlier laughed the hardest, now leaned back in her chair as if enjoying a rehearsal of a play she knew by heart. Kyle Beckman passed his phone to the analyst beside him, showing something that made both smirk under their breath. The message was clear. They had decided who they wanted to represent the strategy, and Dion was no longer it. Trent's voice wavered as he tried to explain market positioning, stumbling over a comparison chart Dion had spent 6 weeks perfecting. He paused, eyes flicking nervously across the room, then toward Dion as if begging for a cue. But Dion remained still. Let him sweat. Let them all watch what happens when you strip away substance to chase optics. As the slide transitioned, it became obvious Trent didn't fully understand the structural logic behind the timeline projection. He rushed past a section titled Multi-Phase Synergy Mapping, skipping 3 bulleted layers that anchored the entire transition model. Dion clenched his jaw, not because of the omission, but because not a single person in the room corrected it. No one raised a hand. No one noticed. Or, if they did, they didn't care. In that moment, the strategy became theater. The truth was less important than the performer. The remainder of the presentation limped to a close, with polite applause that sounded more like an obligation than respect. Jeremy offered a few half-hearted compliments, then quickly shifted focus to logistics for the next stage of internal alignment. Not once was Dion's name mentioned. Not once was credit given. He sat through it all, quiet, observing, memorizing every omission, every silent participant in the act of professional erasure. When the lights came back up and people began gathering their things for the client reception upstairs, Jeremy clapped a hand on Trent's back and said, "Not bad for a fresh face. Keep it up, and we'll get you in front of the clients more often." Trent laughed nervously, nodded, and mumbled something about just doing his part. Dion stood slowly, collected his case, and walked out behind the rest, head high, gaze forward. They thought the presentation had ended, that the slides had spoken, that the brief applause had sealed the illusion they crafted. But Dion knew better. Strategy was not a slideshow. Strategy was control. And control never lived in a projector. It lived in the systems, the approvals, the hidden scripts behind the user interfaces that these same executives had no patience to read. When the elevator doors opened, he walked ahead of the others, heading straight for the executive suite reserved for coordination between the legal, financial, and compliance teams. It was time to initiate the release protocol for the cross-border transition packages, the real skeleton of the merger. His plan had always been to authorize it directly after the integration pitch. That had been the cadence. That had been the timeline. But now everything had changed. He reached the central console, logged into his terminal, and waited. The cursor blinked once. Then again. Then nothing. Access denied. Try again. He re-entered his credentials. The same result. Dion narrowed his eyes and attempted to log into the secure portal instead, the one layered with secondary encryption, the one only 2 people in the building had access to. He was one of them, or had been. Access suspended. Contact administrator. He stood still for several seconds, mentally retracing every protocol. There had been no flags, no compliance breach, no authorization freeze. The only explanation was intentional interference. As he turned toward the secondary system, he noticed Kyle Beckman 2 desks away, casually tapping away at his own laptop with full access, his screen glowing with the same dashboard Dion had been locked out of. Kyle looked up, noticed Dion's gaze, and offered a faint shrug, eyes full of faux apology, then turned back to his screen. It was confirmation, not a system glitch, a decision. Dion stepped to the side, pulled out his phone, and initiated a trace through the secondary secure line. He routed the request through a private server, tracking access permissions to see when the lockout had been placed. The result came back in less than 4 seconds. Authorization revoked. Manual override. Timestamp. 11 minutes after Trent began presenting. Source: IT administrative override requested by Beckman, K. The move had been planned, executed quietly, positioned to align with the public erasure they'd staged moments earlier. They hadn't just removed him from the screen. They had stripped him from the system, from control, from ownership. But what they hadn't accounted for was Dion's own back channel. The encryption key tied not to his employee ID, but to the joint advisory network built outside the company's firewall. The one he had engineered as a parallel structure to ensure neutral data tracking during cross-border negotiations. That key still worked, and more importantly, it tracked every single user who accessed the merger framework over the past 24 hours. As he prepared to escalate the trace, a voice behind him cut into the space. One of the legal consultants, stationed nearby, called out just loud enough for others to hear. We might want to reassign integration alignment to someone with more tenure. This is a very nuanced deal. A few people turned. Dion didn't. He didn't have to. The subtext was obvious. Someone else was making a move. The voice belonged to Gavin Shaw, a senior process architect brought in 3 weeks ago who had never once spoken to Dion directly. Yet here he was, addressing a room full of decision-makers, implying that Dion, the man who had written the blueprint they were all standing on, was unqualified to lead the next phase. Another man chimed in, nodding toward Dion's workstation and asking if someone could double-check his edit credentials to avoid mistakes. It was said with a smile, wrapped in that disarming corporate politeness that always accompanied betrayal. Dion slowly turned, looking at the group gathered behind him, Gavin, Kyle, and 2 other managers from compliance. None of them made direct eye contact, but none of them looked away either. They had chosen their moment. In their minds, they had identified the risk. Dion was too quiet, too central, too connected to the mechanics they didn't fully understand. And now, in the final stretch of a historic transition, they had decided to sideline him, not through confrontation, but through doubt. Whispered questions, paperwork rerouted, credentials revoked, one step at a time, one silent blow after another. It would have worked on someone else, someone who relied only on institutional access. But Dion had built a second map. Every seat around the table had a printed nameplate and a customized agenda packet, each carefully aligned with rank and relevance, except the one at the farthest end, next to the utility shelf near the catering cart. That seat had no nameplate, no printed material, not even a glass of water set in front. A junior coordinator pointed toward it without meeting Dion's eyes and gestured for him to sit there. No welcome, no explanation, just placement. Dion walked to the chair slowly, placed his folder down, and sat, his expression unreadable. From his vantage point, he could see every face, but was seen by no one. No one turned. No one acknowledged. Introductions began, and as each name was read aloud and followed by a summary of title, responsibility, and accolades, Dion's was skipped without pause. The moderator moved from one executive to the next, noting accomplishments and strategic significance in rehearsed tones. When the sequence reached his side of the table, the moderator simply nodded toward the person beside Dion, calling him the final member of the core facilitation team. Dion was left unnamed, unspoken, unacknowledged. There was no error. It was intentional, a methodical act of exclusion designed to render him invisible before any ideas were voiced. Across the table, Kyle leaned toward Pamela and whispered something, clearly referencing Dion, and they both stifled laughter. A moment later, someone else, one of the client-side consultants from Luxembourg, glanced at Dion's empty station and made a remark just loud enough for others to hear. Didn't know production sent someone over. Wasn't expecting print services to sit in. The words drew scattered chuckles, the kind masked as casual sarcasm but sharpened to cut. No one corrected him. No one clarified. Even among his own colleagues, there was a studied silence, as if confirming that Dion's presence there was neither strategic nor respected. Jeremy Stratton, seated 2 chairs to the left, raised his coffee cup slightly and added something that sounded like everyone contributes in their own way, right? Which drew more polite laughter, though the glance he gave Dion afterward was anything but lighthearted. The presentations began, and Dion remained still. He did not lean forward. He did not raise a hand. He listened, closely, watching how points were framed, how credits were distributed, and how every key insight that originated from his research was now being paraphrased by someone else, as if born from their own imagination. Trent Collier stumbled through a section of compliance procedures that had been meticulously layered with international regulation constraints. Concepts Dion had embedded weeks ago, now reduced to vague generalizations and legal buzzwords. The clients nodded anyway. The performance was the priority, not the content. Dion's absence from the narrative was being rehearsed into fact. At one point, Gavin Shaw referenced an alignment model and incorrectly labeled a set of verticals as Tier 2. Dion knew the correction instinctively. It was Tier 3, as labeled by internal audit to avoid equity fluctuation during tax deferment. But no one seemed to notice. Or worse, they noticed and didn't care. He realized the erasure wasn't just about credit, it was about presence. The act of minimizing him wasn't accidental or careless. It was structural. They were orchestrating a version of history in real time where Dion never existed, where the architecture didn't come from his mind, where the success of the project belonged to faces they were more comfortable promoting. As the second hour dragged on, one of the European partners, a French executive named Leclerc, turned slightly toward Dion during a technical debate about systems integration. His eyes narrowed, clearly scanning Dion's position at the edge of the table. Then, with a smirk, he leaned back and commented that it was nice to see the operations team attending. Perhaps we'll hear from facilities next. He didn't look at Dion directly. He didn't have to. The implication was direct. You don't belong. Dion said nothing. But inside, a precise calculation began to unfold. He was done listening to distorted echoes of his own work. He was done being the silent backbone of a conversation that continued without him. Every component, from cost synergy projections to systems convergence milestones, had been engineered with meticulous precision, and he had planned to deliver it himself. It was not just a technical walkthrough. It was a statement of intent. But when the screen changed, his name wasn't there. Instead, the slide read Strategic Value Transition presented by DVS Advisory. The deck was unfamiliar, generic. It lacked the multi-layered structuring he had embedded into every chart, every transition model, every timeline checkpoint. He sat upright. His files had been removed. His name erased. No warning, no rationale, just deletion. A few heads turned when they noticed Dion's posture shift, but no one addressed it. The projector advanced to a slide filled with market comparison graphs that lacked context, featuring statistics that were outdated, some even misaligned with a revised regulatory forecast issued last week. But the presenter, a polished external consultant named Brian Mallory, continued unfazed, reading from a set of bullet points, as though the information carried meaning. It didn't. Not the way Dion had designed it. The logic was gone. The thread severed. Dion glanced down at his notes, which now matched nothing on screen. The page in front of him felt like a blueprint to a structure that had been replaced overnight with a cardboard cutout. Across the table, Jeremy looked directly at him for the first time since morning, eyes sharp with intent. There was no apology in his expression, no hesitation, just a quiet message. This is no longer your floor. Kyle leaned over to Gavin and whispered something that drew a chuckle. Pamela glanced at Dion and smirked, then returned to her laptop without another word. It was a coordinated maneuver, silent, calculated, and absolute. The client representative, Leclerc, seemed confused for a moment, clearly expecting something more substantial. He raised his hand and asked a question about integration thresholds and cross-departmental alignment. Brian paused, blinked twice, then stumbled through a vague response about flexibility and best practice. It didn't land. The silence, afterward, stretched a bit too long. Gavin cleared his throat and leaned in, smoothly cutting into the pause to say that the plan was under refinement, and the firm had decided to keep things streamlined for clarity today. He didn't look at Dion when he said it. He didn't have to. The implication settled like dust over the room. Streamlined, a euphemism for sanitized, for controlled, for scrubbed of anything that might challenge their fragile consensus. Dion was not simply excluded from this phase. He had been airbrushed from the process altogether. No handover, no backup presenter, no explanation, just absence, as if he had never existed in the workflow, as if his contribution had been theoretical and conveniently forgettable. But what they didn't realize was that their replacement slides were based on an early draft, one Dion had abandoned weeks ago after discovering an embedded cost overrun path that could explode under real market volatility. They were presenting a dead framework, and none of them even knew it. He remained still, but inside something shifted. The decision to erase him wasn't tactical, it was personal. They had watched him construct the strategy from the ground up. They had sat in rooms where his voice led, and then they had calculated the optics of replacing him and decided that image mattered more than intelligence, that comfort mattered more than competence, that the room looked better without him speaking in it. The slide advanced again. Another watered-down chart. Another half-truth packaged as insight. Jeremy adjusted his chair and leaned into the mic to thank Brian for the clarity of the presentation, adding that it was important to maintain a tone of consistency and professionalism in front of external stakeholders. He then said that assigning the presentation to a seasoned consultant had been a mutual decision to ensure alignment. The word mutual echoed in Dion's mind like a bad joke. There had been no conversation, no vote, just silence and omission disguised as policy. Dion scanned the room. Not a single person looked uncomfortable. They had accepted the rewrite of history without question, eager to move on. He took a breath and nodded slowly, but not to anyone else. To himself. They had chosen illusion. He would respond with fact. They had chosen noise. He would respond with signal. He opened his phone beneath the table, discreetly accessed a mirrored archive of the original deck through a secured proxy server he had installed months earlier, long before the first signs of internal resistance began. The real presentation, the one they had just tried to bury, was still intact. In another 10 minutes, they would discover their data mismatched the latest compliance review. In another hour, they would be asked to defend a financial model that no longer fit the merger's tax framework. And by end of day, an international observer from the European Commission's regulatory division would request a clarification that only one person in the room would be able to answer. But no one had asked for Dion's insight. Not yet. They believed they had removed the risk. In reality, they had removed the only person capable of keeping the structure from collapsing under its own miscalculations. But rather than admit any error, Jeremy and Gavin doubled down, waving off the concerns as back-end syncing delays or version mismatches in the archive system. Their confidence was brittle. Their control, a performance on the edge of breaking. Dion watched it all in silence, fingers steepled in front of him, the mirrored version of his deleted framework open on his tablet beneath the table's edge. He hadn't spoken for over an hour, hadn't moved since his work was hijacked and misrepresented. But when the South American legal liaison raised a direct question about cross-jurisdictional liability sequencing, a model Dion had created specifically to avoid merger violations and maintain internal audit integrity, no one on the presenting team could answer. There was a pause, a silence stretched too long, and Dion made a decision. He stood. The moment he rose from his seat, heads turned. Not all, but enough. There was a brief flicker of attention, a shift in the room's balance. He adjusted the button on his blazer, cleared his throat slightly, and spoke in a calm, deliberate voice. To clarify, the liability sequence was designed in 3 tiers to minimize tax exposure under foreign asset alignment statutes. The decision matrix was embedded in version 2.4 of the asset rotation deck. His voice was not raised, not confrontational, but it cut through the room with clarity no one else had delivered. The silence that followed was not empty. It was taut with recognition. Several people leaned forward, surprised not just by the accuracy, but by the presence of someone who had just been erased hours before. The room went dark for a split second before transitioning into a dimmed ambient setting usually reserved for breaks or informal discussions. The microphone Dion had been speaking into went silent without warning. He tapped the button. Nothing. No sound. Behind him, Jeremy leaned toward the console control panel and tapped twice. The signal light flashed red. Gavin stood and placed both hands on the table. With an expression caught between practiced politeness and suppressed frustration, he turned to the room and said, "Apologies for the interruption. We'll resume the planned agenda shortly." It was smooth, controlled, but hollow. Dion remained standing. He looked at the faces around him. Several delegates seemed uncomfortable now. 1 or 2 began murmuring to the person beside them. Kyle Beckman, seated with his legs crossed and one hand toying with his phone, didn't even try to hide his satisfaction. "We appreciate contributions," Gavin added, "but for the sake of time and cohesion, we ask that side commentary be held until the appropriate forum." Dion took a breath. He stepped slightly forward, opened his tablet, and held up the screen where the original slide deck was clearly visible, watermark intact, time-stamped 3 weeks prior. The title across the top, Strategic Integration, Tiered Liability Sequencing. There was no mistaking it. It was not a side commentary. It was the source. The room didn't move. No applause. No objections. Just silence. And then Jeremy broke it. "Dion," he said, his voice sharp now, with none of the earlier pretense, "you are not listed on the speaking docket. If you insist on disrupting the remaining sessions, we will have to ask you to step out." The words carried weight. Not legal weight, but performative authority. The kind designed to turn perception into pressure. Then, with full composure but unmistakable steel beneath the surface, he added, "Security can assist if necessary. Let's not waste the client's time." Several heads turned now, not to Dion, but to Jeremy, their expressions unreadable, some stunned, others too comfortable to object. Dion didn't move. He stood still, holding the slide, letting the timestamp and the document speak the truth they tried to erase. And though the microphone had gone quiet, his message had already landed. He knew what came next. They had just made a mistake. They had drawn the line themselves in public, in front of international observers, and chosen force over fact. They had revealed their fear. Because when power responds with silence and security, it's no longer certain of its control. He wasn't angry. He wasn't rattled. He was exactly where he needed to be. The call connected, and his voice dropped to a controlled register, stripped of emotion and charged with intent. "Confirm execution window. No delay. Authorization code Sierra 9. Proceed." There was a pause. The voice on the other end responded with the same tone, measured, professional, unquestioning. Dion ended the call with a simple good, then slipped the device into his jacket pocket. The decision had been made hours ago. The execution had been scheduled a week before. He hadn't needed to raise his voice, assert dominance, or demand validation inside the boardroom because the truth was always waiting here, outside the room they tried to lock him out of. He straightened his cuffs, checked his watch, and walked slowly back toward the glass doors, his steps silent on the marble floor. Inside, the meeting was dragging. The presenters were cycling through the final segment of the replacement deck, their language hollow and repetitive. A few clients were visibly disengaged. Leclerc scrolled through his phone. The Singapore delegate was whispering with her assistant. The mood had shifted entirely. What began as a display of power had devolved into uncertainty. Jeremy's voice, once confident, now carried a faint edge of strain. He tried to steer the conversation back toward projected milestones and deliverables. But the room had cooled. Something was missing. Something essential. Then the door opened, and Dion stepped in, not with force, not with noise, but with a presence that silenced the room more effectively than a gavel. He didn't speak. He didn't move beyond the threshold. He didn't need to. The shift came immediately. A man in a dark navy suit, seated near the middle of the table, raised his hand slowly. He wasn't from the host team. He wasn't from the client legal division. He was one of the observers from the parent company overseeing the acquisition, an executive from Malon Capital, the financial juggernaut funding the entire merger from behind the scenes. Until now, he had remained silent, taking notes, listening. But now he spoke clearly and firmly. "Before we continue, I'd like to request that Mr. Voss return to the table." Silence. The kind of silence that consumes air and makes chairs creak under shifting weight. Jeremy blinked, unsure how to respond. Gavin opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The Malon executive continued, "If we are expected to move forward, we expect full transparency and leadership continuity. Mr. Voss built the integration framework. If he is not driving the transition, this merger halts now." His voice was calm, but it echoed like a verdict. Across the table, Leclerc looked up, suddenly very interested. The Singapore delegate tapped her pen once and nodded without a word. Another partner leaned forward, quietly closing his laptop as if resetting the room's focus. Dion remained by the door, his face unreadable. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. He simply waited. Jeremy attempted to recover. He mentioned structure, internal delegation, team dynamics. But his words faltered, disconnected from the momentum that had just shifted in real time. Then another voice joined, the compliance officer from Zurich, soft-spoken but direct. The original version of the integration plan aligns with our regulatory timeline. What was presented today contradicts the risk profile we approved. We'll need to revalidate under the original author's guidance. It was no longer a request. It was a realignment, and the room knew it. Kyle sat frozen, mouth slightly open. Pamela typed rapidly, her eyes darting between tabs as if trying to catch up with something already gone. Gavin leaned back, arms crossed, ice cold, saying nothing now. Jeremy looked to Dion, then to the Mailon executive, then back to Dion. He cleared his throat, forced a smile, and gestured to the empty chair near the center of the table. "Mr. Voss," he said quietly, "please, if you would rejoin us." The invitation wasn't his to give. It was a formality, an attempt to reclaim control that had already slipped from his hands. Dion stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately, he approached the table and took his seat, not the corner seat they had relegated him to before, not the nameless station by the refreshments, but the chair at the head of the table, directly across from the lead partner of the client delegation. No one objected. No one moved. His tablet appeared once more, the real deck glowing to life in front of him. He adjusted the display settings, activated the projection channel, and the screen lit up with the true title. Phase Consolidation Framework, authored by D. Voss. Clean, documented, unassailable. Every term he used aligned with the internal language of the partner institutions. Every financial contour mapped with clarity that only comes from deep authorship. Delegates leaned in. Pens scratched paper with urgency. Laptops opened for the first time with genuine purpose. The difference between the earlier fabricated deck and what now appeared on the screen was night and day. More than presentation, it was mastery. What had once been buried under layers of politics and pride now shone with undeniable truth. Then came the moment no one could ignore. The Mailon Capital representative stood again, this time not to ask, but to declare. He didn't address Jeremy. He didn't consult with anyone at the table. He turned to the group and stated in a voice that cut through any remaining doubt, "For the record, Mr. Dion Voss is not just leading this integration. He is the architect of the entire acquisition strategy. This merger exists because of his vision, his execution, and his authority. And effective immediately, his decisions will be final for all phases moving forward." The sentence settled across the room like a gavel striking the table. Jeremy shifted in his seat, pale beneath the sheen of overhead lights. Gavin glanced down. Kyle looked stunned, as if realizing in real time how wrong he had been. Pamela blinked once, her fingers frozen on the keyboard. Dion didn't react outwardly. He nodded politely toward the Mailon representative and continued with the next slide, moving seamlessly into the International Treasury alignment, a section they had previously skipped because no one in the room could interpret the volatility model he had constructed. Now, not only did he explain it, he outlined fallback options in case market exposure fluctuated within projected inflation spikes, then cross-referenced each contingency with liquidity reserves already approved by the board of syndicated trusts in Zurich. Delegates took notes with sudden urgency, no longer evaluating his presence, but relying on it. Another partner, this time from the London office, raised a hand to request clarification on a minor clause involving equity redistribution. Dion answered with a single tap on his tablet, pulling up a clause nested 3 layers deep in the transition protocol, a document no one else had even referenced. That was the moment it clicked for everyone present. This wasn't just a consultant who had built a good model. This was the architect of the system itself, and they had almost removed him from the very table he constructed. A shift in tone began to ripple outward. The Singapore delegate asked Dion to confirm if the transition protocol he had designed would remain intact or undergo adjustments post-approval. Dion responded with composure, confirming that his original plan remained valid, with minor structural refinements to accommodate current regulatory flux. She nodded once, noting something on her document, her demeanor now wholly respectful. Across the table, the Zurich compliance officer leaned forward and requested that Dion brief their team directly after the session. Other departments, once passive observers, now made notes to coordinate sessions with Dion exclusively. The entire structure of engagement shifted in real time. No longer peripheral, Dion had become central, the gravitational force drawing all movement inward. Meanwhile, the previous voices of authority, Jeremy, Gavin, Kyle, fell silent not because they had no questions, but because they no longer had relevance. They had been exposed not just as wrong, but unnecessary. Then, as if to seal the moment, the lead client representative from Roth Lancaster, the European investment firm co-signing the funding package, rose from his seat. With calm authority, he stated plainly, "Our continued participation in this transaction will depend entirely on the strategic oversight of Mr. Voss. We will not proceed otherwise." It was not a request. It was not diplomatic. It was absolute. The line had been drawn. Everyone saw it, and no one dared to step over it. Dion acknowledged the comment with a nod, but offered no additional remark. He didn't need to. The room now revolved around his leadership. Everything else was peripheral noise. All the whispered jokes, the deleted slides, the revoked access, the insults masked in executive pleasantries. None of it mattered anymore. They had tried to make him invisible. Now he had become unavoidable. He returned to the closing segment, outlining the timeline for implementation. His delivery was steady, unemotional, focused on function. He didn't gloat. He didn't retaliate. He remained anchored in the material, letting competence speak louder than pride. The session concluded with a soft ding from the clock overhead, signaling the end of the scheduled time slot. Delegates stood not with impatience, but with deference. As they collected their things, several approached Dion directly, offering business cards, requesting follow-ups, expressing gratitude. Not once did anyone ask Jeremy or Gavin to coordinate. Not once did Kyle receive a glance. The hierarchy had rewritten itself, and the ink was dry. The fingerprints on these breaches all led back to a handful of names: Kyle Beckman, Gavin Shaw, Pamela Yates. It wasn't just sabotage. It was coordinated obstruction. Documents tied directly to the erasure of Dion's work had been tampered with in an attempt to reroute authorship and remove tracking metadata. And when matched against Dion's encrypted backup logs, the contrast was indisputable. Legal had what they needed. Within an hour, all three individuals received internal notices of investigation and immediate administrative leave pending formal review. Their company badges were deactivated, their system access revoked, their names removed from the merger's official records. They weren't escorted out by security. They were told to leave the premises with all personal items and no further interaction with clients. For once, the silence in the halls was directed at them. Jeremy Stratton didn't fall immediately, but his reckoning came quickly. A private call with the general counsel turned into a recorded review session with the Board of Ethics and Oversight, during which his dismissive language, willful neglect of protocol, and repeated personal interference with Dion's responsibilities were laid bare. The call ended with a blunt statement from the senior partner. "You've compromised client confidence. That is non-negotiable." Jeremy didn't return to his office after that. He walked out of the building quietly, past people who didn't meet his eyes, past receptionists who didn't greet him, past the glass doors that had once opened for him automatically, but now felt indifferent. His resignation was announced as a personal decision to explore new opportunities, but no one believed the lie. The internal email was sterile, unsigned, and read like an obituary. News of the fallout didn't stay internal. It couldn't. Less than 24 hours after the merger meeting concluded, a leaked internal memo surfaced online detailing the investigation into systemic exclusion, racially motivated obstruction, and unethical data manipulation. The memo didn't name Dion directly, but it described the exact circumstances, the timeline, and the names of every executive involved. Journalists seized on the story with speed and precision. Headlines broke across financial networks, mainstream outlets, and tech business columns. The narrative was explosive. lead architect erased from billion-dollar deal in corporate cover-up. Whistleblower framework saves global merger from collapse. Internal racism allegations rock Ashcroft dealmakers. Each story drove public interest, triggering a wave of scrutiny not just on the firm, but on every consultant connected to the project. Social media erupted. Analysts, professionals, former employees, and clients shared their own stories of being sidelined, undermined, or quietly erased in rooms where they had earned a seat. The wave of collective memory added fuel to the fire. Hashtags formed around Dion's name, not just as a professional, but as a symbol of integrity under pressure. Advocacy groups picked up the case, calling for immediate reforms in corporate accountability. Even a senator issued a public statement applauding Dion's restraint and calling for transparent diversity audits in global firms. Ashcroft Global had no choice but to respond. The official statement came 48 hours later, a carefully worded letter of apology acknowledging internal failures, systemic bias, and procedural violations during the merger process. It named no names but acknowledged all responsibility. It promised immediate reforms, external audits, a restructuring of the senior management vetting process, and the appointment of a third-party committee to ensure no such behavior could be repeated. But Dion wasn't watching the news. He wasn't reading the statements. He was already 2 steps ahead. While the company scrambled to salvage its public image, he was on a call with the Roth Lancaster Group, finalizing the adjusted implementation schedule and onboarding a new transition lead for the APAC sector. Then another call followed with Zurich Compliance to initiate the oversight package, followed by a briefing with Melon Capital to ensure post-close integration would remain shielded from political disruption. His focus had shifted forward. He wasn't interested in watching consequences unfold. He was building what came next. Still, the ripples reached him, not as headlines, but as moments. Gavin Shaw's name quietly disappeared from the company website. Kyle's LinkedIn status changed to open to work. Pamela filed a privacy claim after her internal emails were referenced in legal documents made public. Jeremy was last seen boarding a flight alone, his once prized partnerships no longer returning his calls. The very individuals who had once dismissed Dion with smirks and silence now faced an outcome shaped by their own decisions, not his vengeance. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't struck back. He had simply remained present, prepared, and patient enough to let truth run its course. The building looked the same from the outside, glass gleaming under morning light, steel ribs catching the blue of the sky, but inside, the energy had shifted. It wasn't the kind of change that comes with a new marketing campaign or a leadership shuffle. It was quieter, deeper, the kind of change born not from strategy, but consequence. In the weeks following the scandal, the boardroom that once echoed with unchecked laughter and whispered dismissal had been restructured, both physically and philosophically. New names filled the meeting agendas. Anonymous surveys became policy. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, wasn't just a compliance checkbox anymore. It had become a conversation embedded into every planning document, every promotion track, every leadership pipeline. And the name at the center of that evolution, though not displayed on walls or plaques, was known by everyone. Dion Voss hadn't returned to reclaim anything. He hadn't demanded recognition. But the legacy of his stillness, his foresight, his unshakable control had set into motion a transformation none of them had anticipated. It began with an email, not from legal, not from PR, but from Kyle Beckman. Short, direct, and without self-pity. He asked for a meeting, not to defend himself, not to explain, but to learn. In his message, he admitted to the role he had played, acknowledged the harm he had caused, and asked whether Dion would allow him to take part in the leadership ethics program Dion had just launched through a new nonprofit venture called the Horizon Initiative. The program was designed to train mid to senior executives in cultural humility, strategic empathy, and accountable governance, not as a punishment, but as a foundation for future leadership. Dion read the email twice before responding. He didn't offer forgiveness. He didn't offer comfort. But he did offer one thing, an invitation. Kyle attended the first session 2 weeks later. He sat in the back, took notes, asked no questions. He didn't try to be seen. But afterward, he stayed behind to speak quietly with Dion. No one recorded what was said. No one posted about it. But from that day forward, Kyle's name appeared regularly in internal memos about transformation initiatives. Quiet work. No spotlight. Just movement in the right direction. Pamela reached out a month later, this time not by email, but through a mutual colleague. She wanted to contribute funding to the mentorship wing of the Horizon Initiative. Her name wouldn't be listed as a sponsor. She didn't want press coverage. She only wanted to give. Dion accepted the funds, but insisted they be used specifically for public high school students in underrepresented zip codes, with all metrics made public for review. Pamela agreed. She later signed up as a mentor herself, working with 2 students from a school just outside Newark. She never mentioned the boardroom again. Jeremy never contacted Dion directly, but he submitted a written statement during an internal hearing on post-scandal ethics reforms. In it, he admitted that his biggest failure wasn't the dismissal or the sabotage. It was the belief that silence was a neutral position. He acknowledged that leadership required not just intelligence, but courage. His statement was read aloud at a private summit attended by the top 30 partners of the firm. Dion wasn't there. He was at a local university that day, guest lecturing on systemic resilience and high-stakes negotiations. But he heard about the reading afterward. He said nothing. Meanwhile, the Horizon Initiative expanded rapidly. Backed by a coalition of private firms, nonprofit networks, and a matching grant from Malon Capital, it launched regional programs in Chicago, Atlanta, and San Diego within the first quarter. Its focus was not just on corporate rehabilitation, but on building something new, a leadership class born from the edges, trained not to assimilate, but to reconstruct. Its board was majority-minority. Its executive director was a woman who had once been rejected from a Fortune 100 internship because of her natural hair. Its curriculum was written not by theorists, but by survivors of exclusion who had become strategists in their own right. Dion remained involved, but not central. He declined titles, deferred interviews, and refused to be cast as a symbol. His approach was always the same: quiet influence, deep infrastructure, scalable change. When the Ashcroft firm invited him back for a ceremonial reconciliation summit, he didn't attend. But he did send a letter, which was read aloud by a newly appointed partner from an underrepresented background. In the letter, Dion wrote, "Real progress begins where comfort ends. If you feel uneasy, you're finally growing. Do not look to me. Look to the system you were part of. Rebuild it, or it will be rebuilt without you." The room was silent for a long time after the letter ended. By the end of the fiscal year, Ashcroft had restructured 40% of its leadership training framework. Anonymous reporting lines were now mandatory. Mentorship programs were externally audited. Partner promotions were subjected to cultural competency evaluations. The firm didn't do this to protect its image. It did this because it had learned the cost of failing to. And somewhere, far from the boardrooms and the press conferences, Dion walked into a classroom filled with first-generation college students and placed his tablet on the lectern. He didn't talk about what had happened. He talked about what comes next. About leverage. About systems. About power that doesn't announce itself, but changes the room when it walks in. And the students listened not because he demanded it, but because they could feel that every word was real. The story didn't end with applause or triumph. It ended with structure, with continuity, with the slow, deliberate work of repair. And for the first time in years, a place that once tried to forget him now built its future from the lessons he left behind. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. What part of Dion's journey hit you the hardest? Was it the moment he was erased or the moment he reclaimed the room without raising his voice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear your perspective.